Okay, well, hello everybody. I am excited to be popping on in here to do a monthly live stream. Today I'm going to be streaming cross-platform because we are doing a special promotion this month for my online course, 5 Days to Ignite Your Love Light. And this is a course that tends to dig deeper into mindset stuff. In my method, the McWilliam method, this is the first principle, and it relates to cognitive reframing, which is essentially resetting your mindset so that your thoughts and your beliefs and the way that you perceive the world can be better integrated and can become more flexible and open up the possibilities for you. Now, one of the things that people seem to respond to in the last most recent live stream I did was some language I used around how to determine if you are a vibrational match to someone, and acknowledging that sometimes when you are a vibrational match, on the surface, it may look like disagreement, but sometimes the energy that you bring to a contrast or a conflict or a disagreement in a relationship is actually the same energy, just expressed on two sides of the same coin, right? So in fact, you are a vibrational match for each other. It's just difficult to see it because in the moment, in the world of physical form, we experience that as a conflict or a contrast. So I thought today I might offer some examples of how to navigate that. So one of the things that I had mentioned was when we try to meet each other on, let's say, a playing field or a playground or what some theorists might call a transitional space, in which we want to adopt the premise that there can be multiple realities, that my reality can exist just as much as my partner's reality can exist, and both are valid and both are equally important and can be prioritized. How do you do that? How do you step into a play space like that and advocate for yourself, right? Advocate for your authentic self and your needs and your feelings and whatnot, without running the risk of negating or invalidating or pushing onto or withdrawing from whatever the other person's authentic self and reality and feelings and needs might be. So in order to address this topic, I want to talk about spiritual and relational attunement. Now, if you have ever picked up more than one self-help or personal development book, off the digital bookshelf, I'm sure you've read a million tips and tricks on how to call in abundance into your life, especially now around this time of year, right? But what is abundance really? Well, in a word, attunement. So in today's video segment, I want to talk about attunement. I'm going to define attunement, and I'm going to define this in two different contexts. And the first one is spiritual attunement, and the second one is relational attunement. And then I'm going to touch upon how and why these two types of attunement are actually very intricately connected. And both forms of attunement are so crucial because they allow us to escape the validation trap. And that is what allows us to become truly vulnerable. Okay. So first I want to tackle spiritual attunement. Now, spiritual attunement is when your inner self, sometimes it's referred to as your inner being, the essence of your spirit, your higher self, your higher knowing, your soul, or if you're more of a psychologically minded individual, it could just be the unconscious self, right? Or our archetypes that simmer beneath the surface. So spiritual attunement is when this essential self, this inner aspect of you, is congruent to the degree that it can be with your conscious waking awareness, right? And it's not a permanent state that you can achieve or acquire, like a diploma or a trophy to be hung on the wall or placed on a shelf to be admired. Rather, this form of spiritual attunement, it's an ability, it's a process. It's an exercise that you have to cultivate in order to become increasingly skilled, kind of like training for long distance running. If you stop exercising, if you start eating bad foods, or you allow your self-discipline to slip, then your ability to perform becomes negatively affected. In essence, you fall out of tune with your body and with your skill sets, right? So more often than not, spiritual attunement requires your body to be in some state of, it could be meditation or just relaxation. And if you're preoccupied with survival concerns, fueled by an active attachment system on an instinctual level, The whole of your experience is going to be too concerned with body integrity to really listen for what I'm going to call the subtle messages and whispers of spirit, because this part of you communicates in subtle ways. And so, of course, there will be exceptions to this. Individuals can find themselves in a sticky situation and they have an inkling to turn left instead of right. And who knows, maybe that winds up being the difference between life and death, right? But on the whole, generally speaking, day to day, if you want to be in regular dialogue with your intuition, right, your gut instinct, your higher knowing, you need to have a practice for moving beyond being in survival mode. And that is really a crucial first step. Okay. So if you're interested in learning more about determining whether or not you are in survival mode versus experiencing a real gut intuition, I invite you to check out my video on YouTube, which is called Intuition or Survival Mode, 7 Questions to Know the Difference. I think I also have it on my IGTV channel. So I invite you to check that out. In that video, I go through the chakra system as a framework for organizing energy in the body and for understanding how each chakra will inform you as to whether or not you are in survival mode or really operating under a gut intuition. Now, the second thing I wanted to mention today is relational attunement. So attunement also happens to be a term that's used in attachment theory to describe a moment when you basically tap into someone else's energy, their emotional expression, their thoughts, their feelings, their needs, their desires, and you just kind of get them. You just kind of get what they want and they need. And it's a wonderful, mushy, pink, fuzzy, mergy, connected feeling, right? And in attachment research, this term can also be used to describe the quality of a mother's instinct, in a sense, being able to anticipate and fulfill a child's nonverbal needs. Now, in adult relationships, a good quality of attunement improves communication, makes each partner in a relationship feel understood. It fosters feelings of safety and security, and it increases feelings of love and connectedness. And when that occurs, we might say that the partners are co-regulating each other, okay, to use another jargony term. In essence, this creates a relationship in which personal and spiritual growth and expansion is possible. But accomplishing relational attunement can be just as tricky as tapping into your spiritual attunement. So attachment author Stan Tatkin says that we learn to love by being loved. Yes, but you also have to choose to let love in, to be open to the experience of it. And being willing to let love in is a state that is synonymous with spiritual attunement. So whether or not you make that choice starts with a dialogue that you have to be willing to have with yourself. Now, once you've earnestly begun to engage in that dialogue, it extends into the context of relationships via practicing attunement relationally with your partner and other people in your life. And so a person who is well attuned will be able to accurately and appropriately read a partner's emotional state and respond to it in a way that supports felt security on the level of attachment for their partner. So I just want to add here that this is not like a test, right? While we may have some fantastical idea that a partner should just know what we are feeling and needing and wanting all the time, that's not always the case. And it is true that sometimes you can know your partner so well that you can predict what they are thinking and feeling without them having to utter a word. And that is evidence of good attunement, but it's not a permanent state of being. Even partners in partnerships where there is naturally a high level of good attunement, there are miscommunications. We are all individuals with our own inner lives and private spaces, right? So choosing to consciously practice attunement is important to encouraging things like felt security, and it is a skill that can be learned like anything else. And so being in practice with attunement also creates a safe space for those moments when you feel out of tune with your partner, because it means that you have a strong foundation to support you when attunement fails, especially if you are trying to practice vulnerability. So I want to give you an example. This is something that was offered in my online community. So to illustrate my point, this is a question that was posed in my Facebook feed. I was triggered today by something that happened over the weekend. I decided to be vulnerable and say that I felt sad because of this thing to my partner. I asked, can you help me through this? And what do I do with these feelings? The way that he responded was so hurtful. At first, he was quiet, and then I nudged him a bit about how I needed him to reassure me. I couldn't believe that he was shrugging me off and telling me to move past it. I get that we all have our insensitive moments. I'm so hurt by the original issue, which neither of us had control over really, but he could have taken care of me by reassuring me and not closing and clamming up. When he buckles and doesn't know how to handle feelings, he gets direct and cold and dismissive, and I think that's the avoidant part of him. I decided to practice my vulnerability today because I trusted him with my feelings and I felt stomped on. I don't sweep things under the rug like he would like. I understand not dwelling, but I expressed my trigger and asked for help. I'm so disappointed and hurt at how this went. I'm in therapy working on vulnerability, and this does not feel good. I came in soft and vulnerable, and I wasn't comforted or accepted in the way that I needed. So where do I go with this? Is it just better to keep things to yourself? Isn't this the way to truly bond and build intimacy? So there are a few clues in this question that suggest an understanding of the nature and the quality of attunement on both a spiritual and relational level for this couple might be useful. So the first clue is the quality of the narrative voice, the voice in which the question was posed. So this person expresses their inner voice in the circumstance described in a way that sounds much like a younger part of themselves, or let's say their inner child, might have needed an attachment figure to help manage their feelings when they were younger. And perhaps that parent failed. And so it's likely that a similar occurrence happened for their partner at one point. And so now that wound has a lot of energetic momentum tied up in it for both of them. And it functions as a point of magnetizing attraction for both of them. So we're kind of getting a sense of what draws them together. The second clue is that there's a recognition that it's no one's fault. And when that happens, it can create a control, responsibility, accountability vacuum. So this inquirer's unspoken communication here might be, or what I sometimes call the deep structure communication here might be, these feelings are too much for me and I can't handle them. So you need to help me with it because it's not my fault, it's your fault. And their partner responds by saying, your feelings are too much for me and I can't handle them. You need to deal with it on your own because it's not my fault, it's your fault. And the inquirer also says, when he buckles and doesn't know how to handle the feelings, he gets direct and cold and dismissive. And then the inquirer proceeds to express some criticism and disappointment over the way that this partner copes. Now, this suggests a punitive voice and intolerance of confusion and helpless feelings, while at the same time admitting that they themselves feel confused and helpless and doesn't know what to do with their feelings either. So does her partner not also have the right to feel disappointed and critical of the way she is coping as well? Why is he responsible for having all the answers and providing them on demand? But that's not the point. It's not about who's right and who has all the answers and who's practicing vulnerability better. The point is that in this circumstance, it is the same energetic expression and frequency on both sides. So on the surface, they might feel out of sync with each other because they think they're in disagreement, but energetically speaking, they're actually perfectly attuned. Now, the inquirer also says, I'm so hurt, first by the original issue, which neither of us had control over really. And this is what really clues me in to the fact that there is a control, responsibility, and accountability vacuum, meaning no one had control over whatever the original inciting incident was. So there is confusion about who's to blame and who must take responsibility. And when that happens, we search for someone to pin it on so we can hold them accountable. And this serves to stave off feelings of helplessness or being confused about what we do for ourselves next. But this tends to snowball in a negative direction because everyone is left feeling blamed and victimized with a really bad taste in their mouth. So if you want to learn more about that, I invite you to check my video out on YouTube, which talks about escaping the blame game. Now, the third clue is that in this inquiry, there is evidence of the validation trap. So at the root of emotional confusion and not knowing what to do with our feelings, there's often a need for validation from the external world to kind of affirm our rightness, our right to have our feelings, our right to be angry, our right to feel as if our needs are justified. But who is ultimately responsible for affirming rights like that? So vulnerability is great. But sometimes if we struggle with boundaries and we need too much validation from the external world, we can attempt vulnerability without really mitigating our expectations of the outcome. So vulnerability is really about self-advocacy. And while it's wonderful if it can inspire the outcome that you want in a partner, that's not always what happens. So then we think, oh, vulnerability didn't get what I wanted from the external world or from my partner. Therefore, vulnerability doesn't work. But work at what? Making partners behave the way you want them to? Eliciting validation from people that you assume have the power to affect your fundamental right to exist, have needs, and feel worthy? When and where did they earn or inherit that kind of power? And why do you keep affirming it when it continually puts you both at a disadvantage? So this validation trap is like being born with fingernails and then constantly asking your partner in a million different ways if you deserve to keep your own fingernails. Okay. Now, vulnerability is your authentic self expressing itself, and it's your authentic self. It needs no external validation. It simply is the purest version of you. It is what it is. But we often assume that unless there is some kind of physical reward or evidence of some conditional exchange in a partnership, then your authentic expression must not be worth your investment or your advocacy. And so then you abandon yourself. And that's really what leaves you feeling frustrated and angry, because your authentic self, or your inner child, if you will, feels abandoned by you. And then your ego will again pin that abandonment feeling on the closest thing in your external environment to neutralize the internal conflict and threat that kind of anxiety creates. So it's important to understand that vulnerability in and of itself is its own reward, because it is the most powerful form of self-advocacy there is. And it's likely that you will always be in process with this. It is impossible to get it done and never have to stumble again. But like a muscle, the more that you exercise self-validation, the stronger you will be, and the better you will be able to tolerate uncomfortable feelings. Then the easier vulnerability becomes. So vulnerability is an invitation. It's not begging or asking for validation. And it sounds something like this. I invite you to be a part of my world and to experience the gift of my feelings and the grace that they might offer for all the learning they contain for both of us. And I am strong enough to extend this invitation without really needing you to validate any part of it, even though it is difficult and uncomfortable for me to do so. But I have an idea of the pleasure that can be found in a mutual exchange of co-regulation and attunement if we can tackle and figure this out together. I might stumble. I might make mistakes, but if you can be forgiving of me for that, then I can be forgiving of you for your mistakes as we navigate this foreign terrain. And so your partner accepts the invitation, or they don't. But do you feel the power in this, regardless of how they respond? Do you see how powerful you really are, right up until you make it about the outcome? So do you see how in this way the process of self-validation actually opens you up to a more meaningful spiritual and relational attunement with others? And do you see how this is when you get to actually feel and receive the love that you want so badly? And so the fourth clue that I want to offer here is that there is tremendous hope for this couple in particular, because I see a good amount of attunement already exists. So it's also important to point out that there are strengths in this inquiry, because that can put us in the direction of generating more loving and receptive energy and momentum in the relationship, as well as on the level of spiritual attunement. So first, I'm going to refer to the inquirer with feminine pronouns, because that's how they describe themselves in a heterosexual relationship. So first, she claims that she doesn't want to sweep things under the rug like he would like. But I would say it is probable that he is still with her and wanting to work things out because she doesn't sweep things under the rug. It's not what he would like per se, it's just how he was taught to do things. And so he's probably with her because she challenges that aspect of his own conditioning. And most of us like to be challenged, at least to some degree, by our partners. And if you agree with that, give me a little like or a thumbs up, because I would say that's probably true. Now, second, all the hard work that she's doing in therapy, that she reports doing in therapy, really is paying off because she's clearly capable of identifying and articulating her feelings accurately, even if she feels like she's not so adept at organizing them. And that is no small feat. Most people confuse evaluation words with feeling words, but she does not do this, not once. So evaluation words are words that we tend to confuse for feeling words because they are actually evaluating someone else's behavior and or their proximity to us, and we confuse that as a feeling word. So for example, she could have said, I felt so abandoned, neglected, disrespected, ignored, unheard, unseen by him, etc. But those are all evaluations and assessments of someone else's behavior. It's not an actual naming and claiming of your own state. But instead, she says things like, I felt so hurt and disappointed. Bravo, because those are true feeling words. And that means that it's likely that she is making progress towards tapping into the authentic self and exercising her vulnerability muscle. She's also assuming responsibility for her feelings, right? So what might strengthen the response from her partner in this case is adding some specificity and positive action language to this conversation. I'm going to give you a little bit of a snip and taste of this right now, but I invite you to check out my 3-part video series on compassionate communication on my YouTube channel, or if you're in my private Facebook group, you can check it out in the units in the sidebar menu on a desktop. So for example, she says, I asked, can you help me work through this? And what do I do with these feelings? And she felt like this was a statement and an invitation to the person that would allow them to accomplish co-creative solutions, but he didn't respond well to it. In fact, he clammed up, okay? Now, the good news is that this is an invitation to explore co-creative solutions. The bad news is that it is articulated with vague and scary language. For her partner, this is likely to sound like an invitation to traverse an emotional minefield, okay? So what does it mean to work through something in general, let alone to her? And I might invite you, even as you're listening to this right now, if you want to work through something, what specifically does that look like to you, right? What words, actions, or behaviors would that entail? What if he doesn't feel capable of any of that? And what if he doesn't know what to do with the feelings himself? Would she see him as a failure and rejecting or abandoning of her if he says or does the wrong thing in this moment? Any response he might offer is already set up to fail, and maybe then she'll see him as less worthy and or less of a man. So he escapes this trap the only way he knows how, and that is clamming up and attempting to deflect her attention. She says, at first he was quiet, then I nudged him more about how I needed him to reassure me, again with vagueness, not with specificity, and then he starts to shrug her off and tell her to move past it, right? So her lack of clarity is making him increasingly anxious, and so his coping skills get turned up to high volume, right? Now, adding in some specificity and what Marshall Rosenberg calls positive action language could improve this situation, which she is actually very close to articulating when she says, he could have taken care of me by reassuring me and not closing and clamming up. So this is great because we are getting closer here. So working through something to her looks like offering reassurance. Well, okay then. What kind? What words? What gestures of affection? What allocation of time and frequency of contact? So on and so forth. And so regarding the clamming up, she can also offer a preframe that lets him off the hook for having to be the one that is full of answers or solutions, which he doesn't feel like he has. So she could say something like, you know, if you don't know what to say, that's okay. It would still be a reassuring comfort to me to know that you're as upset and confused as I am, because then at least I wouldn't feel so alone in this, right? So in a nutshell, vulnerability plus a roadmap equals the best possible outcome when it comes to relational attunement. Now, I want to offer another discussion here around how spiritual and relational attunement intersect. And I'm going to offer this through another case example. This is Mike and Michelle's story. Okay. And as I offer this, I'm going to share 6 tips on how you can put these new insights into action regarding vulnerability. And the purpose here is to recognize what I call deep structure over surface structure communications in your relationships. So, what do you mean versus what is actually coming out of your mouth, right? Accessing your feelings intentionally first, so that when you get into a sticky situation, there's more of a time lapse between reacting defensively when you feel triggered. And thirdly, daring to be the braver partner when it comes to inviting emotional vulnerability into the relationship. Now, one thing I will offer is that this next case example is actually a combination of different but similar stories, and the details have been modified to illustrate my point, but hopefully you'll find some resonance with this. So I'm going to call this Mike and Michelle's story. So Michelle is a 27-year-old heterosexual cisgender woman and an administrative assistant. And she's been married 2 years to her husband, Mike, who's a 31-year-old cisgender heterosexual man and electrician. And they are now 8 months pregnant. So Michelle's father was largely out of the picture growing up, and she describes her relationship with her mother as close, but she believes her mother is likely a functional alcoholic and has a predominantly negative attitude and outlook on life. Michelle is well aware of her abandonment issues regarding her father and suspects that they probably impact her relationship with Mike. Now, Mike expresses love and affection for Michelle, but lately has been feeling a bit smothered by her constant need for reassurance, and he is worried about becoming a father. So both of Mike's parents are still married, but it was a strained marriage when he was a child. Currently, there's not a lot of conflict, but he describes their relationship as stale. And he sees his parents as having sacrificed too much for keeping an unhappy marriage together for the sake of the kids. And he's worried about repeating the same pattern in his own marriage. So here I'm going to share what Michelle reported as the primary issue in their communication and how she experiences that conflict. And then I want to break down Michelle's report using these 6 steps to help you decode what the deeper structure communications might be, the more vulnerable, feeling-oriented communication might be. So Michelle says, whenever I try to confide in Mike about my feelings towards anything, he turns what I say around on me, or he tells me I should go to therapy and find people with similar problems to talk to. It's like he always has a point to prove against me, and he doesn't see how it hurts me. I usually just ignore him and I cry at home alone. He doesn't even know how this affects me. I'm sure if I brought it up, he wouldn't understand and he'd get angry and he'd call me negative or something. It's like he and I aren't even on the same level of connection, and it hurts me. He never confides in me, and he's often quiet around me, and I don't know how to get him to open up. So for example, when I start to share my worries about my mom with my husband, he tells me I'm negative too and how I am a lot like her. But I try very hard not to be like her because her behavior scares me, and I don't understand why he would try to flip that around on me. Why does he criticize me instead of just listening? So we're going to talk a little bit today about how we can help Michelle and Mike recognize the downward spiral that they tend to fall into and start communicating on a deeper level of emotional honesty and vulnerability. So the first tip here is to adopt a healthy premise. Okay. So when most couples or even individual, partners come to me and they describe a conflict that they're experiencing in their relationships, they are usually operating under a set of false premises or beliefs about themselves and the possibilities for love in a relationship. So these usually sound something like, my partner is so selfish, they just don't care. My feelings don't matter in this relationship. My partner just wants me to follow orders. I always end up abandoned in relationships. It only works if I make it work. I'm doomed to be like my parents. There's just no stopping it. I'm too intense and too needy. I'm a burden to my partners. I'm unlovable and unworthy. Any partner I attract will eventually discover that and leave me unless I mess it up first, right? So adopt a healthier premise would be to realize that love is not always congruent with need satisfaction. And at the same time, you have every right to feel your feelings without worrying whether or not they are too needy. So in other words, just because Mike could not emotionally hold Michelle in the ways that she needed during these conversations doesn't mean that he doesn't love her in the ways that he knows how to love her to his fullest capacity. It is also possible that he may not be able to meet her needs in this particular area, maybe ever. But that doesn't mean that the relationship is doomed or that he's a jerk. It just means that Michelle may have to be more cognizant and creative about how to get her needs met. And that also is contributed to by understanding how highly she prioritizes that particular need, right? And that also includes learning how to respond to Mike's deep structure communications instead of his surface structure communications. So responding to what he is defending rather than to the defensive response, right? But to be honest, Mike does make a point when he says, it would also be beneficial for her to find a therapist in a group of women going through the same things that she is. Now, importantly, the solution is not for Michelle to abandon her needs or to discount them, because equally she has a right to have and express them. But if that right depends upon Mike's responsiveness and his validation, and he is not equipped to handle them, it is going to inspire Michelle to suppress her needs, and then they will spill out into the relationship in ways that feel aggressive, maybe passively aggressive, or emotionally manipulative to Mike. And this is what I call emotional crowding or leakage. And then they both begin to hold their love hostage until the other measures up by succumbing to whatever their conditions of love might be. Now, the second tip, so that's the first tip, that one was to adopt a healthy premise, right? So my partner cares about me, and every form of communication is about establishing connection and avoiding anxiety, right? So that's a healthy premise we might adopt. Now, the second tip is to recognize your own feeling response. So Michelle says, for example, when I start to share my worries about my mom with my husband, he tells me I'm negative too and how I'm a lot like her, but I try very hard not to be like her because her behavior scares me. Now, here it's likely that Mike's response was stimulated by a combination of the quality of Michelle's delivery and the predictions that he was already making about how this conversation was going to go. But let's start with what Michelle might have been able to control in this situation, because she was the one who wrote and in seeking help. Okay. And so the thing that we might be able to touch upon here is her delivery. So let's assume the short version of what Michelle was expressing might sound like, my mom is negative, she's going to die alone and miserable, and I can't help but let that affect me. I'm so helpless in this situation. But the futility of what is being expressed here is really not the whole truth of the matter, and it's not really addressing why Michelle may be expressing that to Mike. What is she asking for from him specifically here? So I recommend starting your communications with your partner by letting them know at the beginning what you need and want and expect from them. So for example, I feel like I need to vent a little, but I don't need solutions. I just want you to be present with me as I voice this aloud. I promise I don't expect you to be my therapist or to fix it. I just want you to listen, right? Now, after establishing an expectation like that, Michelle's deep structure communication to Mike, maybe it sounds something like, I see my mother struggling and I worry about what that means for me. My fears of ending up alone make me keenly aware of a growing emotional distance between us. And I wonder how we might both be able to feel more secure and connected moving forward. It's really important for me at this time because we are going to be parents. And I want to make sure that we both know how to meet each other's needs before the baby arrives. Okay. Now, Mike is likely to be a bit more receptive towards this because he has similar fears, and his responses are usually at their core geared towards avoiding that very same outcome of loneliness and emotional distance in a relationship as well, right? Now, the third tip is to, let me just restate that one again. So that second tip is to recognize your own feeling response. Okay, so let's jump on over to the third tip. Ask questions. So ask questions because you are curious to know more, not because you're searching for the answer that you are wanting or anticipating. It's important to express curiosity about your partner's experience without making assumptions or predictions, because the minute that you make an assumption, you start collecting evidence to prove your point, and you stop attending to what is actually being expressed. And so in communication, this amounts to waiting for your turn to speak, as opposed to empathically listening and responding to what the other person is saying from their perspective. So it might sound something like this. I'm curious, do you feel this distance between us? Is connection something that you want too? When do you feel the most connected to me? When do you feel the least connected to me? What needs do you have that are not being met right now? How can we find ways to get both of our needs met? Right. So ask questions. That's tip number 3. Tip number 4, Recognize your partner's deep structure communications and give them the benefit of the doubt. So let's first examine the communications that have already been delivered in our example. So Michelle says, "It's like he always has to prove a point against me and he doesn't see it, but it hurts me. I just ignore him and I came home and cried alone. He doesn't even know how this affects me." Now, it might be useful to realize that Michelle is identifying an anxious trait or activating strategy, which is using something called punitive withdrawal as a form of protest. So for anxious open hearts, protest behaviors usually function defensively in order to reestablish contact and control. So Michelle's withdrawal is intended to protect herself, yes, but it also often is meant to inspire a partner to chase her down. So typically there's a fantasy that the offending partner is going to realize their wrongdoing and swoop in to rescue the wronged partner from their isolation. Oh, let's see how well he does without me now, right? Why would they do this? Well, because that's what Michelle would feel compelled to do if Mike were to pull away emotionally. But that's not Mike's inclination. And so it is a coping skill that will leave Michelle feeling perpetually abandoned in this relationship, right? Now, we might also note that Mike's response, which Michelle experiences as critical, is actually very telling of his capacities for holding this kind of emotional material for Michelle. So to Michelle, his surface structure communication, "You need to find a therapist or other people with the same problems to talk to." For her, that feels like a deflection, and it very well may be, but it is also very good information. So rather than also respond defensively to this kind of deflection, Michelle might notice what he is deflecting from and respond to that instead. So behind Mike's deflecting criticism, his deep structure communication probably sounds something like this. "I'm overwhelmed by your feelings and your needs because I know there's no way for me to really fix or solve this for you. That makes me feel helpless and incompetent when you inundate me with them and expect me to be able to just sit with it. It causes me great discomfort and anxiety, and you keep doing it, which makes me feel like you don't care about my feelings. Plus, it's hard for me to empathize with what you're going through, and I don't really understand it. So I try to protect you from my discomfort by turning off or tuning out, because the other option is to yell at you and say something I don't mean to get you to stop." Right? But rather than tell Michelle all of that, because he's not likely to be consciously aware of his own feelings in this way, or if he is, he may not be able to articulate it in the way that I just did, Mike tells her to find another source of support. And perhaps it comes across as snide or flippant because he's trying to obscure the helplessness that he feels in that situation, which he probably thinks would make him appear weak and on some level is worried that it would be a turnoff for her. And it is possible, and maybe even likely, that Mike is not totally wrong here. On some level, Michelle is looking to him to be the big, strong man who can manage her issues and make her feel better about them, right? In a way that is, let's say, a more present father might have been for her. And Mike might be able to hold some of those parts for her as a current attachment figure in her life. Because in our adult relationships, we do give ourselves permission to love in the way that children do. But it is unlikely that he can hold all that she is requesting. Mike could never be her father, and that is not the kind of relationship he wants with her, nor is that ultimately the kind of relationship that Michelle truly wants with Mike either. And so it's also likely that Mike has not been taught how to be present with his own emotions, let alone a partner's, and try not to fix or run away from them. And so to this, Michelle might say, "But he never expresses that to me, that he feels any kind of discomfort or anxiety when I talk like this." Well, no, of course he doesn't. And why not? Well, why do you suppose Michelle responds to Mike by running away and crying alone in her room, rather than expressing her discomfort or anxiety openly? It's a fear of being vulnerable. And why? Because you think that's going to put the relationship in danger. So the next question might be, but if he gets so upset, does that mean that I can't express my feelings to him? And again, this is a circular question because it brings us back to steps 1 and 2, right? Or tips 1 and 2. The basic premise is that you must accept that you both have a right to your feelings. But that requires you to know what your feelings are and that you are communicating from a deep, structured place. So in this example, neither Michelle nor Mike are really quite expressing their true feelings. They are expressing all of the defensive goop that is layered on top of them. And so this question also suggests an underlying premise that your partner is not allowed to get upset when you are upset, and vice versa. And this stems from a fear that we will shatter if we have an uncomfortable feeling, and that our partner will too. And so all conflict and uncomfortable feelings are banished from the relationship. But here's a secret. You are not going to shatter. Okay. In fact, if both partners can adopt a healthy premise that conflict can and does actually open a door to intimacy, it will. Conflict, or what I like to call contrast, is in a relationship can make you increasingly aware of each other's true edges, right? Or we might call it your personal boundaries, which means it is a process by which we discover new and authentic facets of one another. And that is an expedition worth exploring, right? So tip number 5, stand your ground. Now, if approaching the conversation from a deep structured place feels too direct for your partner, or they shrug and they say something like, sure, I feel connected to you, everything's fine, and you feel like that's a deflective response on their part, you can say things like, really, I'm struggling to believe that, because your facial expression and your tone of voice seem to communicate something else. If you're feeling uncomfortable with the question, I'd rather know that than to hear everything is fine. I promise to respectfully receive what you really think. And you have to commit to yourself not to take this personally, right? Now, if your partner responds to that, then you might go on to ask, when do you feel that we have the most fun together? What about that is appealing to you? Perhaps that will help me feel more connected too. Okay. Now, the last tip, tip number 6, receive without judgment or overreacting. Now, please note, having a feeling doesn't mean that you lose all your social graces. Even if you feel triggered by your partner's response, you have permission to experience that as well, and then to glean from it all that informs your continued understanding of that relationship. Shutting down all conversation because you're afraid of feeling triggered is to banish uncomfortable feelings from being shared, and that is a breeding ground for conditional love and emotional crowding and leakage in a relationship. So you can respectfully receive and still have feelings about it. So for example, thank you for your honesty. It does trigger painful feelings for me, and it's hard for me to articulate them in this moment. I may need XYZ in order to process this safely so that I can come back with a clearer head and perspective, right? Or you might say, I appreciate your willingness to open up about this. I am having a knee-jerk response to it, and it's hard for me to stay present with the feelings I'm having right now. Maybe you can help me understand this by walking me through it a little bit more. Before we do, though, it would reassure me to know XYZ. I think that would help me remain present as possible for this conversation, right? So when your partner responds, remember that they may not necessarily have the knowledge that you now have or be aware of their own automatic defensiveness. They might also be wary of a sudden change in your method of communicating, and they wonder if you are trying to manipulate them. So try to keep your tone accepting, receptive, and non-judgmental as you listen to them. This builds trust. It lets them know that you are trying on a new way of communicating because you want to support the relationship by taking responsibility for your feelings and making space for their needs too. So this is not a suggestion to shut down your feeling response to whatever they say, but rather to be as present for their feelings as much as you are for your own while you attempt to navigate your way through a conflict, right? And some people say, well, this sounds so intellectualized or whatever. You can articulate this yourself in this way and have your body be vibrating with the affect, the energetic expression of that emotion, with tears coming down your face, with your countenance expressing the intensity with which you are expressing yourself, right? But I think it is worthwhile, if you want to have an emotionally and spiritually expansive relationship, to think about and be mindful and not so sloppy in our communication, right? If it really is that important to you, you will put in the effort, right? A lot of people say, oh my God, this sounds like a lot of work. Yeah, because you're undoing 30, 40, 50 years of conditioning. Yeah, but it is worth the effort, right? I mean, I presume that's why you'd be watching a live stream like this. So now at this point, you might also think, yeah, well, this all sounds well and good, but just because I'm being emotionally honest and practical doesn't mean that my partner is ready for that. What if they don't respond in a supportive or receptive fashion? So that kind of brings me back to what we originally talked about, how vulnerability is not about eliciting a response from a partner. It's not about trying to affect a certain outcome. It is the highest form of self-advocacy there is. And it's about sitting in that kind of vibration, honoring your most authentic self. And also, just because you show up authentically or vulnerably doesn't mean that your partner will too. It doesn't. But it is the only way to create the possibility for that. And if they don't show up, that's important information for you too, because then you know, remaining with that person is eliminating all possibility for getting what you truly want in partnership. Really good information. A lot of us don't ask these questions or we don't express ourselves in this way because we don't want to know the final answer because we are attached and we're afraid that's going to threaten the attachment relationship. It all comes down to survival fears, right? So the task then becomes honoring your desire without abandoning yourself. And that means feeling capable and brave enough to practice emotional honesty and vulnerability effectively. And I hope that the tips and examples and definitions that I've offered here today will help you to do that. So I want to just take a moment to acknowledge the chat box here. Hello, we have Baby Mohammed. We have Slacker Wannabe. Okay, great. Nobody is responsible for my happiness but me. It's not up to them to hold a hidden expectation for validation when I feel shifty about myself. So I do think that there is a shared space when it comes to emotional influence. Coupledom is a microcosm of the collective, the self and then the other, right? So there are degrees of emotional influence that we have over one another. And that's really the wonderful utility of boundaries, because if you can become increasingly aware of and practice having firm but flexible boundaries, then you can navigate the sometimes very delicious and gratifying terrain of having a shared influence over one another, right? But remember that these are states of expansion and contraction. We are always moving in and out of these states with each other. I might be able to just give a visual representation if I could. My son was writing his Christmas list on my whiteboard. He really wants a VR headset, and he's not getting a drone though, I'll tell you that. Okay, so let's say this is you, and let's say this is your partner, right? That more visible. This is you and this is your partner. So you're going to have, your body is really just the densest part of you. You are just a big energy bubble. And your body is just the densest part of that bubble. So that means there's all this other stuff going on. Your energy actually can project quite far, and you can pull your energy in. So when you're with a partner, usually if you're, loving each other and you're interested in being in a relationship, you have a tendency to extend your energy towards them. You want to open up, quite literally, right? So you want to extend your energy towards them. So there will be overlap. I mean, there is this area, this play space of emotional influence, of affecting each other, ideally in positive ways that allow you to, now that you're connected, to expand in ways that are much larger than you ever would have been able to on your own. That's kind of what I would define as an ascended partnership, as opposed to a soulmate relationship, which is more about antagonism. It's more about, they can be beautiful relationships, and ultimately they are, but they're more about stimulating the ego to dismantle aspects of itself and or to integrate or change aspects of itself so that you can open up to things like an ascended partnership, right? So the only thing when people say things like, no one else is responsible for my feelings, yes and no. Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that we can assume what responsibility we can for our feelings, and no, in the sense that a lot of people who make statements like that take on too much responsibility, and they assume a lot of fault and sometimes more path. And when that happens, we can become a bit grandiose, and our inner critic can become grandiose and really punitive. And we sort of fail to hold others accountable for their role in things. And that is equally an aspect of self-advocacy as well. So it's not an either or situation. There's a gray space. There is a terrain, a navigation between them. Okay. So with that, Knowing everything that you know, how do you coach your love interest towards these goals? It's not your job to coach a love interest. Nope. And you don't want to assume that role, because then you become their therapist. You don't want to do that. What you can do is be an example. What you can do is just pursue your own interests. You can learn these things. You can you can offer it if they, you can say, oh, I learned this interesting thing. Maybe you want to check out this video. I wouldn't try to coach them. But I do have on my YouTube channel, if you look at the playlist for communication, and my YouTube channel is just my first and last name. It's the same as my Instagram handle. There's a 2-part video series about like 3 questions to ask yourself before you try to teach a partner about attachment. And then the other one is like 6 steps to sharing attachment theory with your partner, or something like that. In those videos, there might be some additional guidance around that question. Can you be in an anxious avoidant trap and through an awareness of both parties move towards an ascended partnership? I 100% think that is possible. The only thing I would say about that is if you're in an anxious avoidant trap relationship, it's likely to be a soulmate relationship initially. So those relationships, because there are 2 insecure attachment styles being magnetized to one another, they're actually 2 sides of the same coin. It's actually about sympathetic nervous system activation. And it's likely that it's the same self-wound that is attracting you to one another. So if we were to look at this through the context of a spiritual framework, it's an opportunity to relive in order to revise this wound. And if you can actually do that and integrate it into your experience, now you're above the level of survival. Right now, your body's actually on the level where, oh, I'm not stuck in survival mode anymore. Oh, my nervous system isn't clinging to this person because it thinks I need that person to survive, right? 2 things happen usually. Number 1, you stop being attracted to them because they've served their purpose, and you're now able to see them without the rosy colored glasses of attachment compelling you to be with them. And you're like, why was I with them for so long? Or the second thing that happens is you start to discover new aspects of each other, and you do move into a state of ascendancy. And I have another video on my channel called How Do I Know If It's Real Love? And four types of love, where I talk about this as being kind of like, you can think of it as types of love, or you can think of it as moving through different phases, developmental phases of being in a loving relationship. So I talk a little bit more about that. But anything is possible. Okay, so with that, I have come to the end of my hour. And you should also make a shared evaluation as to the ability of this relationship to attend both parties in direction. So I would recommend checking out my playlist on YouTube called Conscious Relationships. And there's also a video on my YouTube channel called Incurably Incompatible Relationships. And there is an assessment in the caption of that video that I have written to help you look at what I consider to be 12 major compatibility dimensions of relationship. And there are several questions that ask you, how highly do you rate this dimension? What's the priority level on that? How highly does your partner like that dimension? What's their priority level on that? And then you can kind of see where in your relationship you may be experiencing incongruencies, and ultimately decide, is this value that I have in relationship, this value dimension of compatibility, do I actually prioritize it that high or that low? If you don't actually prioritize it that high, and it happens to be a point of friction in the relationship, because it's not a high priority, it may not bother you so much. But if there's a value dimension that doesn't quite match up in the relationship, and you do place a high priority on it, and your partner does not, that's when you start stepping into deal breakers. That's when you start feeling like your needs aren't getting met. And that's when you start feeling resentful, and you start doing the need suppression thing. So I wanted to just offer that. And I'm going to be coming back live after the Christmas holiday. I happen to celebrate Christmas, so I'm going to be taking a little vacay with my current honey bun. And I will see you all when I come back. And once again, I'm doing this as a promotion for the course that we actually have on promotion for 50% off this month for the holiday season. It's called 5 Days to Ignite Your Love Light. And this course is a little bit of a digression. It's not a digression. I still talk about attachment styles. But in this course, I talk a lot more about energy. I'm also a certified Reiki practitioner, and I talk more about how our limiting beliefs impact our manifesting power. And we also have a shaman, the shamanatrix Kristen Von Fox, who joins us in this particular online course to do a soul journey for opening the heart chakra, which happens to be, I think, one of the most preferred and favorite activities of those students who've already attended. And so I invite you to check it out. I'll put a link to that in the caption of this video. And I will see you on our next live stream.